Here at the Philosophical Research Society, where we offer classes in horror film, literature, culture, history classes, theory classes, and sometimes master classes with filmmakers. And so we have our website. I don't know whether you guys are here through us or through our partners at the Philosophical Research Society, but just in case, our website is miskatonicinstitute.com, and you can see all of our classes there. And tonight is a special night because we normally have one class a month, and because it's October, obviously we wanted to do a little more, because if you're in the horror community, October is kind of the special month. And Mitch Horowitz, who is the lecturer in residence here at the Philosophical Research Society, is somebody who I had seen speak earlier in the year when he was here and was blown away. And so when there was the opportunity for us to collaborate with the Philosophical Research Society on putting on an event like this together in conjunction with Mitch's visit, I jumped at that, and it was great to be able to figure out how to utilize his massive wealth of occult knowledge to be able to tailor it to kind of more of a horror-themed class. But before we introduce our special guests and everything, I did want to just take the opportunity, because she is here visiting, my co-director at the Miskatonic Institute in New York, Jacqueline Castell, is here, and she is going to tell you a little bit about our class that we're doing in December, which she is going to be moderating. So everybody please put your hands together for Jacqueline Castell.
Hello, thanks everyone for coming out, and it's really exciting because we did present this at Miskatonic in New York, the same lecture by Mitch, so it's really exciting to see it come here to LA. As for the class that's coming up, I'm going to be moderating it here in LA. It's on Thursday, December 12th, and it's for the British surrealist artist Penny Slinger, and she is this great sort of undiscovered gem, and I think up there with the masters of surrealist art. Her work's incredible. She's made her own tarot decks. Her work is absolutely stunning. She's going to be here on stage. She's in her 70s, and we're going to be going through a whole retrospective of her career, and her stuff's phenomenal. So just a little plug for it, because I really think that she's going to come to be known, someone that's going to be huge in that sort of surrealist canon. So you should all come out Thursday, December 12th for that. Penny Slinger. All right.
And just to tell you a little bit more about this school, this institution that we are in, that are our host for our classes, I also wanted to bring up Dr. Greg Salyer, who is the president of the Philosophical Research Society. So, Greg?
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you for coming out. I just wanted to take a moment to tell you where you are and who we are, in case you don't know. We're founded by Manly P. Hall in 1934 as a resource for seekers of wisdom. So he provided this incredible library that I hope you'll come back and see sometime, of esoteric and non-esoteric, exoteric texts, modern philosophy to alchemy, tarot to psychology. And the idea is to help you on your path to wisdom. And the genius of Manly Hall was that he laid this open for all seekers on all paths. Well, not for seekers who were mean, so are destructive. If you have compassion, if you have a good intention, we're here for you to provide resources for you through our library, through our events. It was just over a year ago that Kayla wrote me and said, Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies, we'd like to come play with you. And I'm like, philosophical research and horror studies, I like it. And so I got to doing a little research. And of course, Manly Hall, our founder, was great friends with Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. In fact, let me share just one little short story. In 1940, a promotional film trailer for Lugosi's fourth film with Boris Karloff, called Black Friday. The trailer purported to show Manly Hall, our founder, with a nurse at his side. This is the genius part, right? He has a nurse at his side hypnotizing Bela Lugosi for his small role in the movie. In the film, Lugosi portrays a man who steals a gangster's bounty, then suffocates in a locked closet. Lugosi's alarmingly realistic on-camera panic and death throes were attributed to the trance that Manly Hall put him into. So just one more thing. I would invite you to our President's Class, where I give lectures every Tuesday night. Right now, we're doing a series called Los Angeles Stories, Interpreting the City of Angels, a city that cannot be interpreted and therefore produces that many more interpretations. We've studied Aldous Huxley. Last week was James M. Cain. Next week is F. Scott Fitzgerald's Hollywood. All right, so we also have some more events with Mitch, PRS events for the rest of the weekend. Lost Literature is tomorrow at 4. And what we'll do is pull some rare books out of our vault, and Mitch will talk about them, 4 o'clock to 5:30 tomorrow. And then tomorrow night's lecture is Mysterious Beasts. I love this title. Mysterious Beasts and Natural Wonders. That's at 7:30 tomorrow night with Mitch. And then Saturday, the Miracle Club workshop is full, but you can log in via webinar. So all this is on our webpage, prs.org. The Philosophical Research Society is really proud to have Mitch Horowitz as our lecturer in residence. In that role, he comes here a couple times a year and shares his wisdom. And he also helps us with new publications or new editions of Manly Hall works. Mitch is a unique person. I've never met someone who moves through the world the way he does. He's a happy warrior for the right to follow your bliss, a sharp critic for those who would deny that right to others, and a genuinely good guy in a world full of bad guys, posers, and power brokers. Please welcome Mitch Horowitz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much. I really am thrilled with the opportunity to do this event for you tonight. It is not necessarily easy to deliver a presentation on the theme of Satan and Satanism. These are terms that get under people's skin. They provoke, and my interest is certainly not to provoke, it's to explore, always and at all times to explore, and to share in my work in a way that is hopefully meaningful to you as individuals, the nature of my own search. I don't see myself as a teacher, I see myself as a seeker. And it's my privilege to be able to share my journey with anyone who wishes to join me on the road for a period of time, and that's the time that we have together tonight. I'm very grateful to the Miskatonic Institute of Horror Studies and to PRS for hosting this event. As I alluded, it is not always easy to speak on this subject. I have been expelled from organizations. I have had invitations to speak withdrawn, and I wouldn't trade any of it for the world, because nothing is more important than the sustenance of the individual search. Nothing is more important, to my mind, than fortifying the individual's ability, my ability and your ability to ask the simple question, what is out there, and to ask it fully and meaningfully, and to do more than just ask, but to participate, to experience, and to look at esoteric learning not as something that belongs behind a museum case, not as something that is a closed canon or book that can't be added to, but something that is alive and ever unfolding, and that gives you, as individuals, the opportunity to discover new powers, new agencies, new possibilities in yourself. My hope is that at least a few of you in this room, by the time we're finished this evening, will leave with a sense of exuberance, because you'll leave with a sense of new possibility. I hope the cultural information, the literary information, the delving into myth and legend and parable and ideas will be interesting to you. But above all, I just feel so aroused and excited that I know some of you will leave this room with a new sense of possibility. And that's what I look for in each of my presentations. That to me is more important than anything else. And so with that, let's begin. I have had a close personal relationship to this subject matter of the Satanic, the Luciferian, the rebel, the opposing force, ever since I've been a little kid. I grew up in a traditional Jewish community in the borough of Queens in New York City. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah at the age of 13, which obviously worked out extremely well. And I was just filled with wonder and aliveness and electricity during Yom Kippur, the traditional Jewish Day of Atonement, when a section of the Torah was read, Leviticus 16, and it spoke of the existence of this demonic being dwelling in the desert on the outskirts of wherever the Hebrews were encamped during their 40 years in the desert. And once a year, on the holiday that we today refer to as Yom Kippur, the Hebrews would prepare a goat, and they would symbolically cast their sins upon this goat and release this horned being into the desert to be devoured by a demonic being who is said to dwell on the outskirts of their community, named Azazel, another horned being. And I was so aroused and thrilled that in the Old Testament, in Torah, there were these references to demons and giants and serpents and dragons and fallen angels. And I can assure you, this wasn't the kind of thing Mrs. Shapiro talked to us about at Sunday school each week, but it was there, and it was thrilling to me. And I wanted to understand from that very, very young age the place that these outsider forces held within the world's religions, all the world's religions. They weren't understood necessarily as something to be afraid of or avoided or shunted, or even necessarily as figures of any kind of maleficence or evil. They were a fundamental part of the building block of the cosmos. There had to be the rebel, the usurper, the outsider, the anti-hero, the opposing force. As a friend of mine puts it, opposition is the best friend. Opposition is the best friend. The Persian poet Rumi wrote, "Pray for a tough instructor." Where will these tough instructors come from? Sometimes they come from the outsider. Sometimes they come from the outskirts. Does this mean evil? No. In the Vedic tradition, there are, of course, the gods Shiva and Kali. Shiva, pictured over here with the pitchfork-type scepter in the background, is the goddess of change, of creative destruction, of wiping out the old that the new may flourish. And Kali, the multi-armed figure pictured next to her, is a figure not only of justice and retribution, but of a kind of divine chaos, the kind of chaos that clears away the old, that unknots things so that new things can grow. And tradition holds, and you should listen to this very carefully, that if you pray for something to Kali, if you pray to Kali, you will get what you want, but you will also unleash chaos. So be careful. In the Nordic tradition, you had, of course, the figure of Loki. This is from a 19th century illuminated manuscript. Loki is world famous today from the Thor movies, which came out starting in 2011, and we're going to get to that since cinema is part of what we're dealing with tonight. But Loki in the Nordic tradition was the god of mischief, was the trickster god, was the god who would play tricks on other gods and on humanity with the intention sometimes of instructing them, and with the intention sometimes of creating outrage in them and seeing what power and possibilities would grow from that outrage. Within the Hellenic tradition, there is the figure of Prometheus, another great outsider who incurred the wrath of the gods. Prometheus, so the parables and legends go, stole fire from the gods, stole fire from Jupiter and Zeus, and brought it down to earth in order to illuminate humanity. We wouldn't be fully functioning beings without fire. Fire can be used to forge farming implements, to forge tools, to forge jewelry, and also to forge weapons of war. Fire can be used to clear away fields and forests so that new things can grow. Zeus was so outraged, so goes the myth, at Prometheus stealing fire and empowering humanity that he punished Prometheus by having him eternally chained to the side of a cliff, and each day an eagle would come and eat out his liver, and he was to suffer this agonizing, eternal exile. However, he was eventually freed by the god Hercules and was allowed again to return to the divine place that was his as an immortal. But he brought full sentience, full mortality to the gods. You see the figure of Prometheus almost everywhere in our culture today. This is from the ceiling, it's actually a detail from the painted ceiling outside the great reading room of the New York Public Library. And this is an image that I hold in just the deepest, greatest veneration. This is an image of an outsider rebel defying the gods, bringing illumination to humanity, and suffering for it ever after. Without the figure of Prometheus, without the energy that Prometheus represents, we would have no search, we would have no intellect, we would never have left the caves, literally and figuratively. You very often find references to horns among gods who are considered to be outsiders. And this stems in part from the figure of Pan, who was the god of the bacchanal and wine and lust and enjoyment and a joie de vivre in the Hellenic cultures. And this is more of a modernist painting by the artist Goya, showing Pam consorting with a witch's coven. Horns seem to occur again and again as a kind of motif against the as a kind of motif possessed by the outsider figures in all the mythologies and parables and religions of humanity. This is exemplified by a very mysterious figure from the ancient Egyptian canon of gods, Set. This is a bas relief of Set, a photograph that I took myself earlier this year at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. There aren't many images of Set to be found in Egypt, even among places where these things are curated and collected. Set was a figure who had a cultic center in the ancient city of Memphis. And Set was considered to be the god of the desert, the god of storms. He was a desert-dwelling being, much like the horned Azazel from the Hebrew tradition. But Set had an unusual twist about him. He was not an identifiable animal exactly. I speak in terms of horns, but the protrusions coming from the top of Set's head are unidentifiable. He has a human body, but his face, his head, it could be an antelope, it could be a jackal, it could be some other kind of desert-dwelling animal, and it's unidentifiable. Archaeologists would refer to Set as the Set animal. There was no precise way of determining what being this was. But like other creatures that existed outside the established order of things in various religious canons, he had these great protrusions from the top of his head. Now, there's another figure, another animal, that appears in the annals of religious history that is found pictured as a symbol of wisdom, of enlightenment, of awareness throughout almost every religion in the world, and that is the snake or the serpent. The snake is present almost at every turning point in the human story, in mythology, in religion, in scripture. And this is particularly true in the Western world, in Genesis 3, where we're taught in the traditional reading that Eve is tempted in the Garden of Paradise by a serpent who asks her, why this God who has created Eve and Adam and clothed them and given them every bodily comfort that they could need, and yet has told them there grows this tree of knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden, and you can eat fruit from any tree in the garden except that one tree that will give you the power of measurement, the power of discernment, the power of intellect. It's there in the midst of the garden, but you're forbidden to touch it. Some biblical scholars, including classical scholars, have even conflated the tree of knowledge and good and evil with the tree of life itself, another tree that was said to grow in the garden. Some scholars have made the case that Scripture refers to those trees by different names, but they are one and the same. And the snake says to Eve, what kind of creator would tell you that you're living in paradise but deny you intellect? What kind of creator would tell you that you have free run over this garden, but you're not permitted to taste the fruit that is perhaps the sweetest and the most extraordinary because it nourishes you with sentience. It nourishes you with creativity. It nourishes you with knowledge, with measurement, with choice. And the snake challenges Eve, and Eve accepts the challenge. And the snake promises her that, contrary to what she and Adam have been told, she will not die if she partakes of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. Eve and Adam are told that you'll surely die if you eat from this tree. But the snake told Eve the truth. She ate from the apple and did not die, and her eyes were opened. And unlike this kind of false shibboleth about feminine nature, Eve did not seduce Adam into biting the apple. She simply went to him and told him that the snake told her the truth, that if you eat from this tree, you will not die. And Adam, too, ate from the tree. And the pair, like Prometheus in Hellenic myth, were expelled from the garden, were kicked out of the garden. The Creator was furious with them. And of course, as the scriptural telling goes, Eve gave birth to two sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain committed this tragic act of fratricide, killing his supposedly pious brother Abel, about which I'll be saying more. And yet, it's possible that friction is the cost of creativity. Just in the same way that Prometheus brought fire that could create jewelry and farming implements and cook meat and create nourishment and warmth, it could also be used to forge instruments of war. Maybe we have no choice. Maybe the price that we pay for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not death, but is friction. And that was seen within the tragic act of fratricide between Cain and Abel. The snake has never really been understood in Western culture because it was so immediately, in the early days of Christendom, associated with evil, with maleficence, with later concepts of Satan, concepts that wouldn't crystallize in the Western mind until many, many generations later. Eve has never been understood properly within the Western world. Eve is the hero of Genesis 3. Eve is the Prometheus of our Western world. She is the Prometheus of our Western world. And she hasn't been understood. Let me be clear. I'm not making a reference necessarily to any religious interpretation or any religious order. Judaism, Christianity, these are all terms that came much, much later. Scripture, just like the Vedas, just like oral tradition from the Hellenic world, just like the sayings of Buddha in the Dhammapada, these were things laid down by human hands to describe transcendental experience. Scripture was written by vast numbers of nameless people over hundreds of years, and it was only in late antiquity that it was canonized, so to speak, and strict interpretations were given. Some books were embraced, some books, the so-called apocrypha, were thrown out, and this is when walls began to be put up, and religions started to formulate themselves as symmetrical, clear doctrines with rules and catechisms and a sense of who's in and who's out. But the fact is, all of these pieces of perennial thought were first and foremost set down by individuals whose names we do not know, but who had transcendental experience, who had universal experience. This is present in Greek mythology, this is present in Egyptian oral tradition, this is present in the pantheon of Persian gods, this is present in Scripture. It has nothing to do with Judaism or Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism. Those are all names that we put on things so we could figure out which house belongs to who belongs where, who can be excluded. These were transcendental, universal human myths, and we can return to them for nourishment without relying upon what anybody else tells us we have to wear as a label, or we have to belong to, or we're supposed to think, without anybody telling us what canonized interpretation we have to live by. We don't have to live by any of those things. We were given fire. We were given fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. Taste it and think for yourself. I mentioned that the serpent has appeared in every tradition and civilization. This is a picture I took myself in Reykjavik, Iceland, about 18 months ago. It's the doorway of the Theosophical Society in Reykjavik. This wonderful Art Deco carving from 1919 depicts a figure that most of you recognize, the Ouroboros. And the Ouroboros is crowned by a Vedic image of eternal recurrence, which centuries later became misappropriated and misunderstood as the swastika. But this is a symbol of the eternal. This is a symbol of life in its never-ending energy and immortality, and it's captured by the serpent itself. The notion of the serpent as a figure of maleficence, as a figure of evil, began to be cemented with the very late scriptural book of Revelation. You see an image here from a late ancient illuminated manuscript from France, which shows the many-headed beast from Revelation and a dragon rising up. You can see the dragon on the perimeter of the illustration and anointing the beast as a leader of civilization, a leader of the earth prior to the supposed second coming of the Messiah. You know, Western culture would probably be very different if the book of Revelation were never written or were never canonized. But the book of Revelation began to cement our ideas of the serpent, the creature that greeted Eve in the garden with knowledge, as being a creature of evil. Here's another illumined manuscript from 1120 AD that shows the Antichrist standing on the back of Leviathan, another serpent. Leviathan is a dragon-like being that emerges from the depths of the ocean, and Leviathan appears in the book of Job, the book of Isaiah, in Psalms. And so here you see Leviathan as serving as a kind of throne to the Antichrist. This is the way in which the serpent morphed from being a figure of wisdom to a figure of maleficence. In certain books of Scripture, both traditional and apocryphal, there was also talk of fallen angels. Fallen angels appear in Genesis, and they also appear in the apocryphal books of Enoch. And these fallen angels were said to mate with mortal women, with women dwelling on earth. And they gave birth to a race of giants called the Nephilim. And the Nephilim were said to be these greatly powerful, titanic figures who began to rule over the earth. And some Jewish scholars reason that the flood in Noah was brought to wipe out the Nephilim. But again, this is an example of the presence of the supernatural in Scripture, which kids don't really learn about. Certainly, we didn't learn about it at Belrose Jewish Center Hebrew School, where I went to school. We didn't spend much time talking about dragons and giants and fallen angels. You know, this stuff, even though it appeared in Scripture, wasn't really part of the curriculum. And as such, it's remained on the margins of the Western imagination. In the book of Job, the Hebrew figure of Satan, the great adversary, the great opposing force, is seen to make a wager with God. And this opposing force, this adversary, known by the Hebrew term Satan, makes a challenge to God and says, I'll bet you that your followers condition their love for you based on good things happening to them. And that if you were to smote your most devoted followers with bad luck, bad tidings, and suffering, your most devoted followers would turn on you. So Satan challenges God in the book of Job. And God, in a way that doesn't seem very compassionate or loving, says, oh yeah? Well, I'll accept your challenge. Job is my most dedicated son. Let's see what happens. And so Job is put through this horrible misery. His home, his health, his family, his worldly goods, everything is stripped from him. And he faces this terrible existential crisis. Why? Why is all this happening to me? His faith is unshaken, and he is finally relieved of his suffering, and the bargain is ended. And Job, feeling that he's owed some sort of an explanation, says to the God of the Hebrews, why? Why did you do this to me? What was the point of all this? And God refuses to answer him and says, well, were you there when I created the heavens? Were you there when I created the earth and the cosmos? And that's the only answer that God gives Job, his dedicated son. As if you don't even have the right to be asking me this question. I find that a profoundly unsatisfying exchange. You're beginning to detect my sympathies. Why isn't Job entitled to ask the Creator this question? I find it extraordinary in a certain way that some of these scriptural stories, which do place humanity in front of deeply vexing existential questions, I think it's a celebration of the human search that these vexing questions have at least been preserved in parabolic form. But I dissent from some of the commentary and the literature, modern and ancient, that has developed around some of these stories. Because much of this commentary and literature, while it's filled with psychological insights, and it's filled with artful interpretations of human suffering, it stops right at the point of asking, what if Job just flipped over the chessboard? What if Job just refused to cooperate with a game in which he had been enlisted as a pawn? What if? what if? The literature and the commentaries comes right up to the margin of that question, but rarely, if ever, asks that question. Another term for the Satanic is Lucifer, light bringer, derived from Latin Vulgate, or morning star. The term Lucifer is very often in traditional culture, mainstream culture, used interchangeably with Satan. Lucifer as a character does not appear in Scripture. The term Lucifer appears in the book of Isaiah and is probably a metaphorical reference to the king of Babylon who was opposing the Hebrews at that time. And you find reference to Lucifer as an adversary who is at one time raised up on high like a great morning star, Venus specifically, and who is brought low, who is proud and is brought low. It was only in late antiquity that this term Lucifer, which is from the Latin Vulgate translation of Scripture, a late, ancient, and very popular translation of Scripture that was recognized and canonized by the Church. It was only in late antiquity that this passage from Isaiah came to be conflated with Lucifer as a personified being. And there are people in esoteric spiritual practice today who make a distinction between Satan and Lucifer. The great esoteric teacher Rudolf Steiner, for example, made that distinction. And there are people, some of whom we're going to meet a little later on in this presentation, for whom that distinction is very, very important. I must say, strictly speaking, I think that I respect it and I honor it. I understand why people make that distinction, but for me it's artifice. For me it's artifice. Because if you go back to primeval tradition, it's just arose by another name. Satan, Lucifer, Beelzebub. These are names that grew out of regional differences in language, but they're referring to the same basic energy, this adversarial force, this force that dissents, this force that rebels, this force that rather than asking, why did you do this to me, says you may not do this to me. This force that flips over the chessboard rather than be a pawn. It's the same force from a primeval perspective. I understand why people wish to make that distinction. I personally do not. But the figure of Lucifer in late antiquity came to be conflated with Satan, was a personified energy from Scripture, although this being never actually appears in Scripture. As we grew closer to the Middle Ages, conceptions of hell as a literal, actual place began to take shape in the human mind. This idea of hell as an actual concrete place where folks who were heretics, pagans, outsiders, outliers were sent and punished for their sins. And of course, the poet Dante, in his Divine Comedy, in the Inferno, helped render vivid in people's minds this concept of hell as an actual place. In the Old Testament, there's not really a concept of hell. There are fleeting references to Sheol, or a kind of netherworld where the dead go. But it wasn't exactly a hell. It wasn't exactly a place of punishment. But Dante, in devising his 9 circles of hell and illustrating them and explaining the qualities of the different sinners and where they would go, helped to solidify this notion of hell as a very concrete place in the Western public's mind. Now, it's interesting to make a study of Dante's 9 circles of hell. I used to think I was going to go to the first circle, which wasn't so bad. That was kind of limbo. That's a place for righteous pagans. And I thought, I'll go there. That's not so bad. And I'll have lots of good company. You will all be there. And that's fine. And then, and now I'm not so sure, you know. But I would like to point the following out. For those people who do believe in hell as an actual literal place and are always sure that it's being reserved for somebody else, I'd like to point out that the worst place in hell, the ninth circle, where Satan himself is said to dwell, and this is Dante that I'm repeating, the ninth circle of hell is reserved for those who commit acts of treachery, betrayers, people who betray one another. Keep that in mind, whatever your outlook is. I think it's just something that one should note in the work of Dante. Lust, wow, you know, that's at number 2. You know, theft, murder, and so on, you know, they fall in there. But the very worst place is reserved for the treacherous. I mentioned that horns were an ever-present symbol among these outsider beings, these outsider energies. And through a misunderstanding and a mistranslation of literature in late antiquity, horns came to be associated with Judaism. In the Latin translation, the so-called Vulgate translation, that's where the term vulgar comes from. It was supposed to be a Latin translation that was available and accessible to everyday people. In the late ancient Latin translation of Scripture, when Moses receives tablets on Mount Sinai, he's said to emerge from the mountain with his face illuminated and his face bearing horns of light. And Michelangelo, like many people of the era, read this line about horns of light very literally and gave his famous statue of Moses horns. A more accurate translation would be rays of light, rays of light. His face was said to be illuminated. Michelangelo wasn't attempting any kind of anti-Semitism or anything like that. He was just making a reading of Scripture as it existed and as it was available then. But this notion of Jews having horns became very widespread in Western culture right up through the 20th century. In fact, I'm sure there are regions of the world today where this is still believed. When I was in high school, I had a playwriting teacher who, I went to the High School of the Performing Arts on Long Island in New York. I had a playwriting teacher who, as a little girl, was a refugee from the Holocaust. She lived in Eastern Europe, and she and her family were able to gain refugee status in England during the Second World War. And she and a group of little girls who also had refugee status were being led through this small town, this village in the English countryside. And as they were being paraded through town, there was a woman who leaned out of her window and in a very thick Cockney accent said, "Those are Jews? I thought Jews had horns." And this was, you know, probably in the early 1940s. And so this notion of the Jew having horns became very solidified in the Western mind. And this is a belief that probably still exists in parts of the world today. Again, more accurate would be the notion of Moses having rays of light emerging from his head. This little amulet here on my side of the screen is a family heirloom. This was given to me by my mother. It's from the early 20th century, and you'll see it shows the figure of Moses more accurately with rays of light coming out of his head. But these were how some of the ideas that we came to about serpents, about horns, about Christ killers, about Satan, about Lucifer, this is how some of these primeval energies, the energies of the serpent, the energies of Prometheus, the energies of the outsider, this is how these things became conditioned in the Western mind. So that when you say the term Satan today, rather than saying it in a way that is more open to question and search, it almost immediately shuts down the conversation because of conditioning. Because of conditioning. And this is where it came from. Another figure who came to be associated with the Satanic is the tragic figure of Faust, which is seen here in a British stage production from the late 1960s. They put on the National Theatre in Britain, put on a production of the Christopher Marlowe play, Dr. Faustus. Now, Faust, as many of you know, was said to be a wizard or an alchemist who struck a deal with the devil, who sold his soul to the devil, a concept that I'll be coming back to. And in exchange for knowledge, in exchange for carnal pleasure, in exchange for an all-knowing perspective on life, Faust was said to sell his soul to the devil and pay this eternal price. Now, before Marlowe wrote his famous play, Dr. Faustus, there probably was a real Faust. He lived and worked in the early to mid 1500s in the Germanic-speaking part of Central Europe. He was an alchemist by reputation, an astrologer, a theologian, probably someone who existed on the radical extremes of the Protestant church. And according to folklore, the actual Faust, who probably died in about 1541, was said to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge. So Faust existed as a figure in folk tradition for many years prior to Marlowe's play. And it's important to understand something about Marlowe's play. It's only one expression of the Faust legend, and it was a somewhat politically motivated expression insofar as there was a backlash in the late Renaissance period against some of the occult experimentation that was going on during the Renaissance. There was a notion that the rediscovery of ancient texts in the Renaissance, texts from Persia, from Egypt, from Rome, from Greece, texts that spoke of different mystery religions, forms of divination, spell work. These things were classified as secret or hidden by the Latin word occultum, or occult. And the notion developed in the late Renaissance that consorting with the occult meant consorting with the dark side, consorting with demons, consorting with Satan himself. And so Marlowe's play, although it's lyrically beautiful, was a fairly simplistic expression of this late Renaissance backlash against the satanic. But it's only one expression. It's only one expression. In actuality, the better known and more textured version of Faust was Goethe's play, which was written many, many years later in 1832. And Goethe presented a different image of Faust and presented a different relationship between Faust and Satan than that of a simple transaction. And I want to say a quick word about Goethe's vision, which I think is captured. You can see this this wonderful portrait by the artist August von Krelling from 1877, which shows Goethe's Faust, or Mephistopheles, Mephisto being a Germanic term for Satan, depicted here almost like in a figure that we sort of recognize a little more. Rather than this grotesque horned Maleficent figure, you can see Mephisto or Satan here as kind of a clever figure who's casting a spell over Faust. This is perhaps captured better by the Irish artist Harry Clarke, who did this Art Deco portrait of Faust and Mephistopheles in 1925. And this very modern image captures a little something of what Goethe was after. Goethe's vision of Faust and Mephistopheles was not quite as simple as Marlowe's. In Goethe's play, what happens is that Faust is tormented by the limits of his knowledge and wishing for a more broad and penetrating and transcendent perspective, as well as wishing for carnal pleasures. Faust makes a deal with Mephistopheles that he will serve him eternally in exchange for vast knowledge and understanding and perspective and pleasure. And yet Faust doesn't quite trust Mephistopheles, and he is the equal of Mephistopheles intellectually in some ways. And the two dance around one another, kind of like sharks circling one another, not quite sure how to structure their bargain, each one trying to get the upper hand, get the better of the other. And they wind up striking a very, very peculiar bargain. Faust, not fully trusting Mephistopheles, strikes the following deal with him. Mephistopheles says to him that I will give you unbounded happiness. I will give you unbounded knowledge. And only if you enter into a moment that is so blissful and so filled with euphoria that you'd be willing to dwell in this moment forever, only then will I take your soul. And only then will you have to serve me for all eternity. So that will be my proof to you that you'll be given everything you want, because you'll be so happy that you'll want to live in it for all eternity. It's a peculiar sort of bargain. Faust accepts it. This moment of eternal bliss never fully comes to pass. And so Faust is never conscripted to serving Mephistopheles for all eternity. So the story ends on a somewhat ambiguous note. It's more psychologically complex than the Marlowe version. And it also summons a theme that was expressed much more thoroughly in John Milton's Paradise Lost, written in 1667. And that is this idea of Satan as a kind of heroic outsider. You begin to see illustrations and interpretations emanating from the work of Milton and in the paintings of modern artists of what might be called the heroic Satan. You can see in this image by Gustave Doré, Satan as this kind of brooding, dissatisfied thinker, almost like a upside-down version of Rodin's Thinker. Rather than someone who's driven to introspection, he's thinking, plotting, planning, acting. This image by the artist Richard Westall, British artist, is a really good depiction of the so-called heroic Satan, the rebel, the one who says no, the one who flips over the chessboard rather than serve as a pawn, the one who says, yes, it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Satan, as depicted in the Westall image, is the one with the outstretched arm, and behind him in the background is Beelzebub, who is kind of his sergeant at arms in Milton's Paradise Lost. Beelzebub is a Hebraic-derived term that became conflated with Satan. It was a name for the god, an alternate name for the god Baal, who was one of the god of one of the competing sects or tribes that lived amid the Hebrews. This image by the English artist John Martin shows Satan in his pandemonium, his house of demons. And it's a good example of the so-called heroic Satan ruling in this underworld rather than submitting in the world above. This is another image of Satan standing outside of his pandemonium, his castle of demons, by Martin. And here, too, is an image of the heroic Satan by the artist Thomas Lawrence, very contemporary looking. But this, watercolor by William Blake, is perhaps the most famous image of the so-called heroic Satan. This is entitled Satan Arousing the Rebel Angels. This is a painting that Blake did in 1808. This is my personal favorite image, in which Satan is seen summoning up his defeated Confederates from a lake of fire to which they've been cast down after losing the battle in heaven. He summons them to arise, and convenes a great council of demons and says, how will we plot our next move? How will we re-engage the battle? And in this great conference of demons that Satan holds in Paradise Lost, they have this big discussion of the next battleground, the next confrontation that they're going to have with Yahweh or God. And they decide that this confrontation is going to take place on earth, home to God's greatest creation, the individual, the sentient being. And there's a variety of demons in Milton's account who say to Satan, let us go instead of you. Let us go to earth and do battle because we need you here. It's too dangerous. And Satan responds to them, well, what kind of a leader would I be if I asked you, my followers, to do something that I wasn't willing to do myself? And so Satan chooses to go on the perilous journey to earth himself rather than sending others in his stead. So Satan was a good manager. Wouldn't you like it if you had a boss who didn't ask you to do things that he wasn't willing to do himself? Don't you hate when your boss asks you to do things that he's too timid to do himself? We've all had bosses who want to send us into battle. You call them and you tell them, blah, 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 blah. You know, they're very brave with other people's skin. Satan was a good manager. Probably Blake's most influential work was his Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Marriage of Heaven and Hell from 1790. This inaugurated the era of the so-called Romantic Satan. The Romantic poets, starting with Blake, were very interested in this concept of Satan as a necessary counterpart to God the Commander. Some of the Romantic poets, including Percy and Mary Shelley, including Lord Byron, and certainly Blake himself, they had a notion that Satan or the outsider was a necessary counterpart to the more conformist tendencies of the figure known as God within the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Blake created his illustrated manuscript, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, to depict wisdom that emanated both from the Judeo-Christian God and from hell, from Satan himself. And so he created a book within The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, a short book called Proverbs of Hell. And Proverbs of Hell would say things like, the same law for the ox and the lion is tyranny. So it was Blake's way of saying there can't be one law or one set of rules that covers the basis for everybody. Another one of the Proverbs of Hell said, no wholesome food is caught with a trap or a net. Another said that the worm will forgive the plow that cuts it in two. These were very interesting kind of koans and ideas that Blake said we needed and we were incomplete without. And we were incomplete without a fuller concept of the satanic. Not everyone was happy about this notion of a romantic Satan. I mentioned Lord Byron. This was a cartoon, a satirical cartoon that was created of Lord Byron, calling him Lord of the Faithless by a cartoonist in 1820. And this is Lord Byron kind of being whispered to by this maleficent figure. And you can't quite see it here, but he's standing on the book of Revelation. And you see there's an anchor over here. An anchor in late antiquity was an image of sainthood. And so this is some of the criticism and the calumny that Lord Byron was subjected to for some of his work. Right around the same time that this cartoon was created, Lord Byron wrote a short play, which I encourage you to read, called Cain, in which he retold the story of fratricide between Cain and Abel from the perspective of Cain. Cain had a point of view too, and Lord Byron attempted to extrapolate that point of view in his 1821 play, Cain. And what Lord Byron maintains in that play is that Abel, rather than being this pious, gentle figure, was in many ways a kind of a dogmatic figure who was constantly trying to push his doctrine on his brother Cain. And Cain, feeling constantly burdened by this catechistic, dogmatic brother of his, eventually struck out in emotional anguish and unintentionally killed his brother. And he had to live with this pain for the rest of his life. But interestingly enough, Lord Byron, sort of adapting what William Blake was attempting to get at in his Proverbs of Hell, in which he said, one law for the lion and the ox is tyranny. Lord Byron, a kind of playing off that principle, saw the brothers as being co-equals, more or less, in the tragedy. Because what Abel was trying to do was he was violating a proverb of hell. He was trying to create one law for the lion and the ox. Abel being the ox, the worker, reliable, tethered by a yoke. In Paradise Lost, one of the demons, Mammon, declares hard liberty before the easy yoke. Hard liberty before the easy yoke. I have a friend who's a very well-known political operative, and he suffered a very, very public defeat about 18 months ago. And I sent him this line from Paradise Lost, hard liberty before the easy yoke. And he wrote back one word, dude, with like 8 exclamation points after it. And sometime I'll tell you who that was, but that'll be another day. So the ox wears the yoke. The ox is a worker. What does the lion do? Well, Lord Byron saw the lion as Cain. The lion can't live under the ox's law. And as the ox was attempting to get the lion to wear his yoke, the lion rebelled and killed him. Not meaning to, but again, friction may be the price of creativity. And the figure of Satan appears as a kind of father figure to Cain in the book. Satan says, I too have dwelt in dust, and I know the thoughts and the feelings of those who sleep and dwell in dust. And Satan makes the case to Cain that, in fact, he was not the serpent in the garden, but that the serpent had the stronger end of the argument, because the serpent brought illumination, even if suffering came with it. This notion of punishing or lashing out at people who were outsiders through satire, through public humiliation, became more popular in the 19th century. This is a cartoon that the artist Thomas Nast drew of the American medium and political activist Victoria Woodhull in 1872. He referred to her as Mrs. Satan. Mrs. Satan. Who would like that as their nickname? Show of hands. Yes, good. Well, Victoria Woodhull was an interesting role model and figure. She was an American spirit medium who served as a medium to the industrialist Cornelius Vanderbilt. And she was very unrecognized in American history until very, very recently, and her name is slightly better known. I think I first wrote about her in my book, Occult America, back in 2009. She was a very interesting figure. In addition to being a spirit medium, she was an activist for women's rights and universal suffrage. And believe it or not, Woodhull, as some of you may know, was the first woman to present a speech to a joint session of Congress on behalf of universal voting rights. This was in the year 1871. It was called the Woodhull Memorial. And later, I encourage you to go on Google and look up Woodhull Memorial. You will find that this speech that Woodhull delivered to Congress in 1871 stands up today as, I think, a really fine statement of human dignity and human political equality. The year after Victoria Woodhull delivered the Woodhull Memorial speech. Oh, a little footnote to that. As I said, Woodhull was a spirit medium, and she was very public and very unembarrassed about this. And after she delivered her speech to Congress, reporters came up to her, not really being able to understand how a woman could have delivered such a rousing, wonderful piece of oration. And they asked her, where did you get your ideas from? And she said, in an entirely ingenuous way, well, you see, I have this robed spirit guide who appears to me in dreams and has given me all of my ideas ever since I've been a little girl. And my Greek robed spirit guide appeared to me in a dream and gave me this speech. So, you know, she was perfectly straightforward about the source of her ideas. And the following year, she she ran a protest campaign for the presidency. She ran on the ticket of a party called the Equal Rights Party, and I'm not sure that she ever wound up appearing on a single state ballot, but it was more than a generation before women were granted the vote, and here was Victoria Woodhull running for president. She was the first female candidate for the presidency, at least on the ticket of a protest party. She named the great abolitionist hero Frederick Douglass as her running mate. But Victoria could be a little slippery, and she never actually told Douglass that she was doing this. So reporters would come to Frederick Douglass and say, you know, how does it feel to be running for vice president? And he would say, I've never heard of this. And so, you know, Victoria did cut some corners, but she was a great figure. She believed in free love, democratic socialism. In fact, she published a newspaper that ran the very first English translation of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. She was a remarkable figure, and she was thus memorialized by Thomas Mast as being Mrs. Satan, an honorable label if ever there was one. The figure of Satan as the outsider began to reemerge in the late 19th century, not only through the figures of Victoria Woodhull, but through the figure of Lucifer getting used in ways that I think were, I would say, faithful to this kind of romantic tradition of Satan as the great rebel, the great outsider. And you'll see here two images. One, Lucifer, a worker's calendar from 1894, which was published by the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. There's a story that I always wanted to share publicly. It's so great. There's an Italian historian named Massimo Intravergne, and he wrote a couple of years ago a really, really wonderful book called Satanism, A Social History. And Massimo delivered 2 lectures in New York City that stemmed from his book. And one person in the audience very astutely asked Massimo the question of about Satan or Lucifer being associated with Marxism, you know, because of this workers' calendar that was named Lucifer. Madame Blavatsky, the great world-traveled occultist, published her magazine, Lucifer, which was a magazine that she began publishing in 1887, and it was a magazine of political protest, political progress, as well as occultism. And so someone asked Massimo this question about whether Satan was a Marxist. And Massimo, in his wonderful Italian accent, said, I don't really think Satan was a Marxist. I think Satan was more of a social democrat. And I always enjoyed that. So the Swedish Social Democrats Party agreed with Massimo precognitively and published their calendar in 1894. This notion of a more humanized Satan played out in Dostoevsky's great novel, The Brothers Karamazov. And here we're going to begin to get to the more multimedia portion of the presentation. I meant to say this at the beginning, and I must say it now. I must thank the director and one of the programmers here at Miskatonic, Jacqueline Castel, for designing this program for me. I mean, these slides and the movie clips and so on, she designed with just absolutely exquisite taste and great technical ability, of which I possess none. If I were left to my own devices, I'd be holding up, you know, a book with a flashlight, and that's essentially, you know, my idea of multimedia. So a deep thanks to Jacqueline. I want to show you a wonderful clip from a Soviet film adaptation of Brothers Karamazov from 1969. And this demonstrates a scene in which the figure of Ivan from the book confronts, apparently, the figure of Satan. And it does a great deal to humanize Satan. And this is a wonderful, classic, and rarely seen movie. It is in Russian, and this version is subtitled, and this is a real treat.
Лучше бы ты затопил камин, а то у меня разыгрался ревматизм. Разве может быть у черта ревматизм? А почему бы и нет? Если я иногда воплощаюсь в человека, то принимаю и последствия. Хоть я и сатана, ничто человеческое мне не чуждо. Ты не глупо. Рад, что угодил. Постой, где же я подхватил этот ревматизм? А, это было там. Там? Где там? Ну, там, у нас. Я торопился на дипломатический прием к одной высшей петербургской даме. Так ты глуп. Ты хочешь своим ревматизмом уверить меня, что ты существуешь, что я никогда... Слышишь? Никогда не поверю этому. Вот на сотую долю не поверю. Но на тысячную ты, наверное, веришь? Ни одной минуты, негодяй! Ни одной секунды! Напрасно, напрасно. Был у вас на земле уже один такой мыслитель и философ. Все отвергал. Законы, совесть, веру. А главное, будущую жизнь. Помер. Думал, что прямо во мрак и смерть. Перед ним будущая жизнь. Изумился и вознегодовал. Это противоречит моим убеждениям. Стой! Я тебя поймал. Этот анекдот я сам сочинил, когда еще был в гимназии. Поймал, поймал, поймал. Нет, это я тебя поймал. Я тебе твой же анекдот рассказал, чтобы ты окончательно во мне разуверился. Лжешь. Цель твоего появления уверить меня, что ты есть. Именно. Но колебания, но беспокойство, но борьба веры и неверия. Это ведь такая мука для совестливого человека, вот как ты, что лучше повеситься. Я тебя вожу между верой и безверием попеременно. Послушай, может быть, ты и сам в Бога не веришь? Как тебе сказать, если ты серьезно, то я... Есть Бог или нет? Не знаю, голубчик, ей-богу, не знаю. Не знаешь, а Бога видишь? Видишь, а не веруешь? Нет, нет, ты не сам по себе. Это я! Я!
Now, an idea that you'll see coming out in this confrontation between Ivan and Satan is that in Dostoevsky's view, the way Satan torments humanity is that he strips us of our certainties and locks us in a place somewhere between faith and doubt. And yet it's curious. In some ways, uncertainty is the greatest place that we can occupy. What's more noble than a question? What's more indestructible than a question? You know, as I was referencing around the book of Job, I think there's this existentialist commentary that has developed around Dostoevsky and other works, not necessarily stemming from the ideas of the artist, him or herself, but creating a kind of canon of commentary. And one of the commentaries, one of the existential commentaries will say that I think has become very overrated in modernity is this notion that humanity is somehow bereft of belief, and that figures like Darwin and Freud and Marx and Einstein and Victoria Woodhull deprived humanity of its belief, of its certainty, and created this kind of yawning abyss of existential doubt. And I question the depth and the validity of that line of thinking. This notion that humanity was possessed of this kind of fortifying belief in some earlier age, I think has been grotesquely overrated. You know, what would be the historical antecedent for that, you know, precisely? It almost takes on a kind of fuzzy, false nostalgic view of how great village life used to be back in the days when we were burning witches and knew that Jews had horns and knew exactly who we wanted to exclude, and weren't the Crusades great because we had a sense of purpose? And I think that obviously, you know, I'm being flippant, but I do think that sometimes these existential commentaries get the better of us, and they kind of create an ideal or a yearning for an antecedent that never really existed. And there are many different ways that one could read things into Dostoevsky's encounter between Ivan and Satan. But one way of looking at it is that the introduction of doubt, the introduction of uncertainty can be wonderful, because I think that the existence of a question is that which is truly noble in the individual. Also in the late 19th century, the concept of the satanic came to be remade, not only by the existentialist writers, not only by political progressives, but by occult revivalists, one of whom was the French occultist Eliphas Lévy, who gave us what has now become this greatly immortalized image of the Sabbatic goat, or Baphomet. This appeared in 1854 in Eliphas Lévy's extremely influential book, The Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. In this book, Lévy makes several references to the Sabbatic goat, the goat of Mendes, or Baphomet, with which this image became conflated. And this figure of Baphomet has become so deeply, deeply cemented within the Western imagination. It's almost impossible to look upon it without being rendered into a kind of silence. It's a powerful image, and it's an interesting image, partly because it's an androgynous image. This figure of Baphomet has breasts, but also has a penis surrounded by these two serpents. On Baphomet's outstretched arms, you see these Latin alchemical terms, salve and coagula, depicting the pairing of opposites, as if to say that the true nature of life, of cosmic life, of transcendent life at its highest is free of gender, And you'll see depictions of this pairing of opposites everywhere, both in the human and the animal, in the waning and the waxing moon. The presence of all kinds of opposites are being paired here in this very, very powerful figure of the ancient goat, the horned being, the being of forbidden or outsider knowledge, neither male nor female. You'll see a pentagram, of course, depicted in the traditional style, the upright style, on the head of the Sabbatic goat, or of Baphomet, but with increasing popularity, you came to see the inverted or the reversed pentagram, which was introduced, or rather popularized, in Western culture by the figure of Madame H.P. Blavatsky. In Madame Blavatsky's enormously influential cosmic occult encyclopedic vision, The Secret Doctrine, she introduced the upside-down pentagram in a popular way into Western life for the first time in the modern world. You can see it, of course, depicted right here on page 5, volume 1 of her 2-volume set, The Secret Doctrine. And she talked about the upside-down pentagram as emanating from Vedic culture and being a symbol of the Kali Yuga, or the age in which we're supposed to live today. And it symbolized the work of Vedic magicians of the so-called left-hand path, the left-hand path. And a definition of the left-hand path in magical terms is not necessarily a veneration of Satan, but it's a veneration of the human will, the human wish. As I describe it, you could say that the left-hand path is my will be done, as contrasted with the Christian notion of thy will be done, thy will be done. That's the more traditional Judeo-Christian notion in which the individual wants to sublimate his or her own sense of self, of desire, of drive to Yahweh, to Jehovah, to the Judeo-Christian God, to the so-called higher. And yet, inverting that formula into this so-called horns-up image of the pentagram we have this formula, not of thy will be done, but of my will be done. This horns up pentagram was further popularized by the French poet Stanislas de Gaida in his book, The Book of Black Magic, written in 1897, in which he took Madame Blavatsky's upturned pentagram and he paired it with Baphomet, or the Sabbatic goat. And he wrote in English above it, Samael, and below it, Lilith. Samael is supposedly an angel, or a fallen angel, if you like, within Hebrew tradition. Supposedly, so goes, you'll find this in Jewish folklore, not in Scripture itself. Samael was the demonic or the angelic being who wrestled with Jacob, leaving him walking with a limp afterwards. And Lilith is a figure, again, within Jewish folklore and rabbinic tradition, who was a kind of feminine oppositional figure who either in some cases is said to have been Adam's partner before Eve or became Adam's partner after Eve, but is seen within Jewish folklore and rabbinic writing as this kind of mysterious, oppositional, outsider, feminine figure, almost like a shadow side of Eve in the book of Genesis. And around the perimeter of this reversed pentagram that de Gaida created, you'll see the Hebrew letters for Leviathan going counterclockwise that spell out Leviathan, the serpent that appears in the books of Job, Psalms, and Isaiah. And before long, the upside-down pentagram came to appear almost everywhere. There were different artists and occultists that were making depictions of it in the late 19th, early 20th century. And this is the image that's perhaps most popular today. The artist who designed this image, this kind of ultimate image that is so widespread today, is unknown by name, but this is an image that will appear very frequently. This particular version is used by the Church of Satan, which I'll say more about a little bit later, and is also featured, on the jackets of heavy metal albums and tattoos. I probably have a tattoo of it somewhere, and it's very popular, but this was the culmination of Madame Blavatsky's introduction to this image to the modern Western mind. Another figure, novelist J.K. Huysmans, was very popular in rebirthing the idea of the satanic into the Western mind. In his novel Là-Bas, or Down There, published in 1891, he depicted members of French and Parisian society as practicing something called the Black Mass. The Black Mass. And you'll hear people talking about the Black Mass all the time. It doesn't really have any historical family tree. It's an idea that we probably wouldn't have even heard of and that wouldn't have come into currency if it weren't for Huysmans' novel. But you'll hear people on late night radio and on the internet talking about the idea of a black mass as if it's something for which there's this simple historical antecedent. There is none. There were certainly individual artists and iconoclasts who engaged in things that they called a black mass, but there's no clear family tree of this existing. Huysmans' novel is one of the primary sources for it, but it played on the Western imagination, and it gave birth to ideas of this black mass being practiced by shadowy covens. And I want to show a clip of a silent era film from 1922 that is just extraordinary and alluring and creepy, even by today's standards, and is said to have depicted this black mass being practiced by witches' covens. The director, Benjamin Christensen, a Swedish director, appears in this little clip as Satan himself, and the clip itself, as I mentioned, is from the silent era. There's no soundtrack, there's no music accompanying it. People who watched this in theaters in 1922 presumably heard music coming from a piano or an organ, but we're presenting it as it exists on film. Stamping on the cross. Now, try to imagine if you were watching this in a theater in 1922. It might be one of the first pieces of moving pictures that you'd ever seen, and the use of light and shadow and fog is just extraordinary. You know, one hears stories of people rioting at the Metropolitan Opera House because they didn't like a given opera, but imagine how shocking this must have been to audiences, and, you know, quite frankly, how persuasive it must have been, because, you know, for its period, the use of light and shadow and some of the various effects are just extraordinary. Here is another, we're going to watch a clip of another version of the Black Mass, which came out in France in the year 1928. The makers of this film are unknown, but it became a very popular film, and we're showing a clip that is accompanied by a score. It's a contemporary score, but the score matches pretty well with the nature of what's being seen, so we felt it was legit to show the clip with this score. And this is a film that purported to be a documentary shooting of an actual Black Mass, a really existing Black Mass. I'll leave it to you, the discriminating viewer, to make a judgment call about the validity of the film as a documentary. Trigger alert, there is nudity, so if you don't like nudity, close your eyes, and if you like it, you're in the right place. So I think we can ascertain two things from this. One is that Satanism was a lot more fun in France than in Sweden. And Also that the cardboard brick background probably disabuses us of the notion that this was a real documentary of a Black Mass. Now, also contemporaneous with this was the emergence of a wonderful Italian actress and bon vivant and socialite named Luisa Casati, who was photographed in France in the early 1920s. And Casati, as you can see from this image, really began to give us our modern conception of the satanic as the forbidden, as something alluring, as something sexually exciting, as something tied into fashion and to appearance and to aesthetics. And as I'll return to a little bit later, you know, it's really Casati who gave us the entire look and aesthetic that came to define a lot of heavy metal and hard rock. I mean, let's face it, no Luisa Casati, no Kiss. You know, is that clear enough? And so she really deserves to have tribute paid to her, and we're going to come back to her. Also contemporaneous with Casati was the artist and provocateur and magician Aleister Crowley. Crowley, too, did a great deal to give us this aesthetic of the outsider, the occult outsider. And as you can see from this wonderful image at the top of the slide, you know, here's David Bowie striking a pose that's a leaf right out of some of Crowley's images. So much could be said about Crowley, and he was such a complex figure, but aesthetically, he was a truly great performance artist, and our culture would look a lot different today if it weren't for figures like Luisa Casati and Aleister Crowley. And of course, jumping forward, a lot of this imagery that got introduced into the contemporary mind, that got introduced into pop culture, into spiritual culture, into the culture of rock and roll, was experimented with at its highest level, I think, in the really, really magnificent short film Lucifer Rising by Kenneth Anger. Anger worked on this film for many, many years. The film itself is slightly less than 30 minutes. A version of it came out in 1972 that in many ways, well, it represented the movie's release but not the movie's completion. The movie was brought to its final completion in 1980. But the version that we're going to see here shows clips that are faithful to Anger's vision, and the scoring, in part, was done by the musician Jimmy Page. And you'll see in the first clip, Anger's vision of the resurrection of Lucifer is a vision of a uniting of all the great pre-Christian religions of the world. Pagan tradition, Celtic tradition, Egyptian tradition. There is a kind of uniting of all the perennial mystery religions of our primeval past. The second clip will show a kind of a sunseed, the birth of this kind of glorious sunseed that is shaped and looks like a kind of flying saucer, and that heralds the dawning of Lucifer, this figure of human striving and creativity and satisfaction and unbounded search. Anger is such a great artist on so many levels. I think the imagery that he brought to this film is as arresting and as perennial as anything brought to the screen by Orson Welles. And he foresaw so much. The images of the sun seeds or these spaceship-like figures that you see in the second clip, they evoke this idea, which I think is becoming more widespread today, and which to a certain degree was pioneered by Carl Jung and by my friend Jacques Vallée, that there's not a distinction between UFO experience and so-called spiritual experience or extra-physical experience, that it may just be that we live in this cosmically larger and multidimensional world that we haven't fully understood, and we can't make these neat lines of demarcation between one kind of transcendent experience and another, whether we call it UFO or spiritual or what have you. Anger foresaw that attitude. He foresaw the rise of that attitude in his imagery. I want to share two quick stories. You saw the clip of the artist Marianne Williamson in the first of the two that we showed. The scholar Eric Davis is speaking here on Monday night, and I encourage you to check out Eric's talk. Several years ago, he and I were collaborating on an Occult America presentation at the Esalen Institute, and we were assembled in a room, and it was a Friday night, and we were giving our opening talk, and there was this very nice English lady seated cross-legged in the front row, and Eric came up to me during a break and said, "Do you know who that lady is in the front row?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's Marianne Williamson." And I was like, wow, motherfucker, like that was quite an honor. And Eric also told me the story that one time, man, it may have been in San Francisco, he was giving a retrospective on the work of Kenneth Anger, and Kenneth showed up and sat down in the front row. So how's that to keep you honest? That was a rather nail-biting evening, which he can describe to you himself. I also want to note that Anger got just extraordinary footage in Egypt, and I know firsthand the experience of shooting in Egypt, and it's very, very difficult. In February of this year, my friend Ronnie Thomas, a great director, and I were in Egypt shooting footage for a documentary that we are making about the occult book, The Kabbalion, a book that I'll be speaking about at our Lost Literature presentation on Saturday. And it's cumbersome, it's expensive, it's intimidating, it's difficult. You can't get anywhere near the Sphinx without all kinds of licensure, and it's just astonishing to me that Anger was able to get the footage that he did. That film is a triumph on so many different levels, and it interjected images into the Western mind that I think are as compelling as any that have been produced in our minds, going back to some of the more primeval images that we've been witnessing. The 60s were, of course, a time of great artistic ferment, spiritual ferment. It was a second wave of the occult revival that was born in the late 19th century, thanks to Eliphas Levi and Madame Blavatsky and other innovators. And there was another great innovator of the 60s who brought the Satanic into the Western mind in a way that it had never before been fully understood, and that was the magician and artist Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. In 1966, Anton declared it the year zero, the year of the Satanic era, and he founded the Church of Satan, and several years later published his Satanic Bible, in which he maintained that the highest act of human existence was the act of following one's own will, one's own creativity, one's own code of ethics and honor, and not accepting or being handed down to any religious code or idea of God, and that the rebel, the outsider, the figure of Satan was the figure that was followed by true men and women. Anton was a great magician, a great intellectual, a great source of insight. He had such a range of fascinating ideas, so much shrewd insight into human nature. One of the things that Anton talked about was the importance of creating a total environment for yourself, an environment in your relationships, in the way you dressed, the way you lived, the places you went, that would inform the highest yearnings of your own psyche. And Anton believed, contrary to what is found in much religious thought, both mainstream and alternative, so-called, that the way you comported and the way you dressed, the way you carried yourself, is as significant a part of your life as any so-called inner experience. In a certain sense, Anton's thought collapsed this wall, this artificial wall that we erect between the inner and the outer. And Anton also, in ways that I think were clearer and more resounding and more accessible, devised methods of so-called sex magic that were greatly accessible to men and women. Anton talked about the idea of sexuality being this enormous force of expanding one's will, one's wishes into the world, not through physical pleasure alone, not through propagation alone, but sexuality as a kind of force of life, that when you're in that state of sexual arousal, it represents, again, a collapse of these somewhat artificial walls that exist between the so-called conscious and subconscious minds. Just last night, there was a wonderful exhibit of some of the artwork of Genesis P. Orridge, and she delivered this wonderful talk over Skype to a number of people here in town. And she made the wonderful, wonderful point that when you're in a state of orgasm, when you're in a state of climax, there is this complete relaxation of the walls that exist between these different qualities of mind that we possess. You're one, you're full, you're whole. And Anton talked about how you could cultivate that state within you through something that he called erotic crystallization inertia, ECI. And his idea was each of us contain within us a kind of sexual body memory in which we felt a sense of arousal for the very, very first time. And this sense of arousal could have come from anything. It could have come from something we saw, something we thought, whatever the case may be. We all have this body memory of when we felt that first sense of arousal. And Anton made the observation that if you could get in touch with that, and if you could figure out what was the earliest inceptive point where you really felt sexual arousal, you could use that to bring yourself, among other things, into this state in which your various minds, your so-called subconscious, conscious mind, rational mind, are channeled in a more powerful way towards selecting and carrying out your agency in the world, towards seeing through that which you wish to see done in the world. I didn't realize until fairly recently Anton's greatness as a magician, as an observer of human nature, as a philosopher. I think years ago I misunderstood Anton. I viewed him as a provocateur. I viewed him as a kind of a huckster. And certainly he had some of those features, and he would have gladly attested to that fact himself. He came from a carnival background. He believed in being the trickster. He believed in being the provocateur, but he was a great deal more than that. I did want to show this wonderful picture of Anton with Sammy Davis Jr. from 1971. Anton is pictured here with Sammy in the middle, and on the other end is Michael Aquino, a great intellect as well. There's also a picture of Aquino with Sammy together. Aquino was a longtime collaborator of Anton's, who in 1975 broke off and formed his own organization. And I'll say a little bit more about Aquino's writings in just a bit, but I think Aquino has proven to be a great intellect himself. I mentioned that Anton was a provocateur and that he embraced the label of provocateur, and you can have some pictorial evidence right here. This is from a magazine called Sun Disc, which was basically a kind of like avant-garde pornographic magazine. And this was an ordinary Sunday afternoon at Anton's house in San Francisco. And he's pictured here in full horns and regalia. And this figure, this long-haired figure, this woman who's standing above Anton and next to the man with the conical hat is Susan Atkins, or at least it's rumored to be Susan Atkins, who was later a member of the Manson family, known by the name Sexy Sadie. That's not a documented fact, but that's the rumor that's out there in the culture. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a few moments. I owe a great debt to a writer, wonderful writer from Sweden, an artist named Carl Abrahamsson. This is Carl and Anton in the late 1980s. This is a picture in which Carl refers to himself as Satan's little helper. Carl ventured from Sweden to San Francisco in the late 1980s to meet with Anton, get together with Anton about 10 years prior to Anton's death. And Carl wrote a book a couple of years ago that some of you may have read called A Culture. And it has a chapter that was a huge influence on me, in which Carl seeks to reassess Anton LaVey as an intellectual, an artist, a magician. And without Carl's influence, this chapter of my own search probably would not have opened. So I feel a very, very deep love for Carl, debt to him, and I really encourage you to read his book, A Culture, which was a huge influence on me. Without Carl's influence, I don't think I'd be giving this presentation right now. Carl is working on a documentary film about Anton's life, and I want to show kind of a sneak peek from this movie. You'll see some early vintage footage of Anton, an interview, a brief piece of an interview with Anton's wife, Blanche Barton, and others. Towards the end, you'll see interviewed a very loud, gesticulating figure who you may recognize.
Anton LaVey was many things to many people. Musician, magician, writer, wild animal trainer, police photographer, film buff, founder of a magical group, and possibly of a new religion. And yes, he was a Satanist. With his creation of the infamous Church of Satan in 1966 and his best-selling book, The Satanic Bible, in 1969, Anton LaVey changed the ballgame in many ways. Here was a free-spirited San Francisco-based group neither in favor of mind-expanding drugs nor of peace and love for its own sake. Here was a group that was decidedly, outspokenly anti-Christian. Here was a group that brought dark pro-sexual psychodrama and the philosophy of Nietzsche straight into the American living rooms and TV couches. Anton LaVey became a celebrity, a scapegoat, who basked in the attention and made a successful career out of it. But who was Anton LaVey behind the public persona that so easily provoked primitive American Christians and other intolerants? Who was this enigmatic American adversary?
And I would say that I'm a very happy man, an extremely happy man, in a compulsively unhappy world.
We no longer live in traditional societies, and you can actively pick and choose and create your own reality based on the things that resonate with you. And LaVey was completely in touch with that and aware of that and advocated that.
The future of Satanism is assured. There's nothing I can say or do that's going to retard it or advance it.
He was a man of deep conviction, and through all of his misanthropy, I would have to say he was an idealist, or else he never would have done what he did.
He is so difficult to fit into the pastiche of occultism in America because he didn't really belong to any clear identifiable intellectual family tree. He created his own family tree, in a sense. He reached backwards to primeval philosophy. He reimagined the idea of the Satanic in a way that had historical integrity, but was also new. Now, one thing humanity is really great at and accomplished at is faction splits. So as soon as there's a religion or an organization that comes onto the Western scene, there must be a faction split. So in 1975, there was a faction split within the Church of Satan, and Michael Aquino, who was pictured with Anton and Sammy Davis a little bit earlier, branched off and formed his own organization, the Temple of Set. Aquino is pictured here with his wife Lilith. And Aquino's contention, among other things, was that the cult of Set that had existed in ancient Egypt was a truer, more primeval representation of the Satanic, and Aquino felt that veneration of Set was a more authentic expression of some of the ideas that we've been talking about. And he produced a great many writings. There are two in particular that I really love and that I highly recommend. One was called the Diabolicon, which he wrote while he was still collaborating with Anton LaVey. The Diabolicon is, in a way, a kind of retelling of the creation myth from the perspective of Satan. It's somewhat like what Lord Byron did in Cain, retelling the story of Cain and Abel from the perspective of Cain. Now, Aquino was an intelligence officer with the U.S. Army. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he was an intelligence officer during the Vietnam War. And on one of his tours of duty in Vietnam, while he was a member of the Church of Satan, he took a paperback copy of Paradise Lost with him, and he was inspired by Paradise Lost and by his experience with Anton to create this retelling of the creation myth from the perspective of Satan called the Diabolicon, which you can find online, and I recommend you check it out. When Aquino broke off and founded the Temple of Set, he produced another short and very powerful book called The Book of Coming Forth by Night. The Book of Coming Forth by Night. And in this book, he describes receiving a kind of transcendent message, somewhat similar to what Aleister Crowley described in his Book of the Law in 1904. And in fact, Aquino saw himself in writing this book and in founding the Temple of Set as kind of following up to what Crowley had begun in 1904, what Anton had begun in 1966. And Aquino felt that his was a kind of culminating effort. And in the Book of Coming Forth by Night, the figure of Set kind of communicates with Aquino and says, among other things, you should pray to me at night. You should pray to me at night when you can see the stars. Were it not for darkness, the stars wouldn't be visible. And you can speak to me as a friend. You can speak to me as a friend, not as a supplicant. And it's a powerful work. It's a work of real literary merit, and I recommend reading it. Aquino is still living. These kinds of splits are always painful, but I feel both men were great artists and great magicians. I mentioned that Aquino saw Set as being a kind of more primeval expression of the Satanic, and I just wanted to share two images I took of bas reliefs and a little statuette of Set that appear in the Egyptian National Museum. Again, Set is not very well represented within Egyptian culture, and when I was there and I would talk to people about it, very often they would scratch their heads and say, "You're interested in what now, you know, precisely?" And then some people would say, "Oh, you're a meditator," because New Age folk within Egyptian culture are referred to as meditators. So that's how, you know, we're understood when we go over there and say, you know, hey, I want to do my 2012 thing or my Set thing, or, you know, go to the Temple of Sekhmet, and immediately the scholar or the tour guide will say, "Oh, you're a meditator." So, you know, Just go to Egypt and tell people, I'm a meditator, and they'll take you to all the things that you want to see. The Church of Satan, of course, continues as an organization today. It's headed by a man named Peter Gilmore, who's an accomplished musician in his own right. This is a favorite picture of, at least for me, of Anton and Peter Gilmore in San Francisco in the late 1980s. These are not altar boys. There was another organization that grew out of the 1960s that was sometimes associated with Satanism called the Process Church. And the Process Church, which was founded in the mid-1960s in England, co-founded by a man named Robert Grimston, is not easily understood according to any label or classification. They made use of terms like Lucifer and Satan, and thus were often classified by journalists and others as a satanic organization, but their theology was much more complex and textured than that. They believed in a kind of quartet of gods, and in this quartet of gods, you had a lower iteration of Satan, which was kind of animalistic and forceful and violent, and then you had a figure of Lucifer, which was a figure of the rebel, the idealist, the romantic, and then you had the figure of Jehovah, which was the figure of piety, discipline, conformity, orthodoxy, and then you had a higher iteration of Satan, which was a figure of nobility and will and higher creativity. And you had to create, you had to pass through these different stages, and you had to experience a synthesis of all these energies, a symbiosis, in order to understand the transcendent state that is really your birthright. We like labels. We like labels. So the Process Church was labeled in the media as being satanic, but its theology was much more complex than that. And I just wanted to share an image of a popular American actress who ran into the Process Church on a London street in the late 1960s, our very own Mary Tyler Moore. Don't you think there should have been a Process episode of the Mary Tyler Moore Show? Like, Mary, you're a Luciferian now, you know. So, but the Process Church was and will remain very controversial, partly because some people purported a tie between the Process Church and the figure of Charles Manson. There really wasn't a literal tie between Process and Manson, but after Manson was incarcerated, he was visited by some members of the Process Church in jail, and they asked him to write an article for one of their magazines. This particular issue was devoted to the nature of evil, and Manson did write this article for them, and they published this magazine with Manson's contribution in 1971. So for that, among other reasons, they became conflated in certain books and in the media with the events surrounding the Manson family, although I think the connection is really spurious. But nonetheless, his byline did appear within their magazine. The reason I show an image on this slide of John Lennon and Yoko Ono is not because there was any connection between the Manson family and Lennon and the Beatles, but there was a kind of popular myth stemming not only from Manson claiming to have received prophetic messages from the Beatles' White Album, but there was kind of a myth within the youth culture, which I remember very vividly, that after Charlie and some of his followers shaved their heads, that it was noticed that Ringo and John Lennon had also shaved their heads. And I remember as a little kid, I mentioned this in Occult America, overhearing my sister on the phone one day with a friend of hers theorizing that Ringo was showing solidarity with Charles Manson by having shaved his head. This was, of course, entirely spurious, but these are the things that existed within youth culture in the early 1970s. So this idea of connections, you know, is kind of like a modern folk mythology. Somewhat contemporaneous to this time, there was an extraordinary horror movie, Rosemary's Baby, made by the great Roman Polanski, and Anton LaVey described this as the best advertisement for Satanism that had ever been created. Anton, who was a trickster, also played a trick on a reporter from the Wall Street Journal in 1969. And he told this reporter that he played the figure of Satan, this kind of cat-eyed figure in the movie. This was completely false, completely invented, but the reporter from the Wall Street Journal believed it, and this is repeated in the media to this day. There was an article in the Sunday Independent in Great Britain a couple of years ago that just made offhanded reference to Anton having played the devil in Rosemary's Baby. It's completely false, but it was the kind of thing that Anton would just do from time to time, and I suppose aside from getting a kick out of misleading a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, he was probably pointing out, look, how do any of us know anything? You know, the Wall Street Journal is sort of a venerated source. People cite it, reference it all the time. I made up this story. The guy did nothing to verify it, and the story gets repeated to this day. I really love Rosemary's Baby. It's my favorite of all horror movies, maybe my favorite movie of all time, because among many, many other things, Polanski demonstrates the existence of the occult, of this dark witch's coven, just in ordinary, everyday life. Ruth Gordon is forever memorable as Rosemary's kind of slightly annoying, slightly lovable neighbor. Everybody has a neighbor like Ruth Gordon, and she is, of course, in a satanic cult. And it was an interesting movie because it captured so much of what was going on at the time. And curiously enough, one of the famous scenes from the movie shows Rosemary attempting to relax in her apartment, and she's snuggling on the couch with a book, and it's Sammy Davis Jr.'s autobiography, Yes, I Can, which was written in 1965. Polanski's film was released in '68. It wasn't until several years later that Sammy began his own affiliation, briefly, with the Church of Satan, and it's just one of these strange things that kind of runs through Polanski's movies. We'll come back to this in a little while, where he just captures something in the zeitgeist that seems to prefigure things. And of course, there was the tragic murder of his wife just very shortly after the release of Rosemary's Baby. And all these things get mixed up into this cultural milieu, and this stuff seems to shadow Polanski's work, a point that I'm going to come back to. A lot of people derive their idea of the satanic and concepts of demonic possession from The Exorcist, of course, made in 1973. You had the heroic figure of the priest, Father Damien Karras, who actually was such a compelling character on screen that it created a spike of applications of young men who wanted to join the priesthood after watching The Exorcist. The performance is extremely powerful. The young woman, Reagan, in the film is not possessed by the devil, but possessed by a demon, a Persian figure, an actual figure from the Persian pantheon of gods called Pazuzu. And this figure is pictured here in a still from the film. He has a serpent for a penis, and he bears sort of a resemblance to Baphomet, like Set. He's a god of the desert. He's an outsider god, a god of storms. And there's a still of one of my favorite scenes from The Exorcist where the figure of Reagan is walking down the staircase backwards. I find those scenes to be a great deal more alluring and exciting than some of the head revolving and vomit spitting scenes. Now, so much of what people talk about and make reference to in our culture comes from entertainment without them even knowing it. You know, people speak very, very freely of ideas of demonic possession or of people making pacts with the devil, and they rarely ask themselves, how do I know this? Where does any of this come from? How do I know that Anton LaVey played the devil in Rosemary's Baby? Well, by golly, I read it in the Wall Street Journal. It must be true. But it was completely invented. And in the same sense, you know, there are ideas about demon possession that run riot through our culture, and the people talking about them don't even know that their own antecedent is entertainment. Entertainment, of course, can be enormously revealing and culturally important. I wanted to show the cover of this book, Black Angels, in tribute to a writer who's still living, Bruce J. Friedman, who's a screenwriter, novelist, short story writer. And Friedman wrote a wonderful and alluring short story in 1966 called A Change of Plan, which appears in this collection. And probably very few of you have heard of A Change of Plan, but this this short, very curious and interesting story that Friedman wrote came to form the basis for one of the most popular and critically acclaimed films of 1972, a film that some of you may have heard of called The Heartbreak Kid. And there are some great subtleties in The Heartbreak Kid, which is a dark romantic comedy that reflect some of the satanic and libertine ideas that Friedman was driving at in his short story. And I want to show two brief clips. This movie is absolutely priceless. It's one of my favorite movies. Charles Grodin's performance is absolutely brilliant. It stars Eddie Arnold, Sybil Shepherd, directed by Elaine May. Everybody's performance in this film is extraordinary, and it tells the story, based on Friedman's change of plan, of a young man who gets married, ventures with his new wife to Miami for a honeymoon, and then meets someone else, and decides that he wants to marry this young woman played by Sybil Shepherd that he's met on his honeymoon. And the first scene shows Charles Grodin attempting to break this news to the parents of Sybil Shepherd. And then there's a second scene which shows a sexual encounter between the Sybil Shepherd and Charles Grodin characters, which has some very subtle imagery, including of a horned being hovering in their background. I want you to watch it very carefully.
I happen to be a newlywed. I made the big mistake about 5 days ago in New York. And when I say big, sir, I mean Radio City Music Hall big. You may have seen her around the pool. She's a nice girl, but just not really my type. I married her because I thought it was the decent thing to do, and I've learned that decency doesn't always pay off.
I think we're close enough.
No, I think we could get a little closer.
You do?
I do. I honestly do.
I think my father misjudged you, Lily. I really do.
See the horns? He's wearing red, covers it with black. She's wearing white. The movie is just filled with imagery like that, and I encourage checking it out. I wish it were commercially available, because I do think that you should always watch things on their commercial platform so that the artist gets paid. But this movie is not available on any commercial platform, but you can find it on YouTube. You'll notice I drink a lot of water during my lectures. Somebody wrote a review of one of my lectures on Amazon Prime and said that Horowitz keeps drinking water out of these plastic bottles, and the leakage of the plastic into the water is addling his brain, which is, of course, true. Now we move into rock culture, and you can see, of course, the reemergence in spirit of Luisa Casati. I mean, again, without her influence, this aesthetic wouldn't exist. She prefigured it by decades, including, in the band I mentioned before, KISS, which some people say stands for Knights in Satan's Service. But they're wrong. They're wrong. I grew up in the same place these guys grew up. It's Knights in the Service of Satan. Knights in the Service of Satan. The internet is wrong. And of course you have Ozzy Osbourne, who adopted all kinds of imagery, including the upside-down crucifix in this rather horrific album cover. I mean, Ozzy is not remotely a Satanist, but, you know, he obviously adopts the aesthetic. Ozzy is a Christian. He refers to himself as the Prince of Darkness, and I don't know, you know, If Ozzy is the Prince of Darkness, I'm Fred Rogers. I just don't. But that is his aesthetic. But you find references to the Satanic coming up in other places, and I would say more compelling places, including in the opening lines of this song by the Sex Pistols. I am an antichrist. I am an anarchist. And there was in the 1980s and 1990s the development of the black metal scene, which was a heavy metal scene emanating from Norway, among other places, that very explicitly, in many cases, embraced the Satanic. There was a huge national scandal and trauma in Norway in the 1990s where historic churches were being burned, and some of this was traced back to members of the black metal movement. Certainly not everybody was involved with it. In fact, it was only a small sliver of people who were involved in the church burnings, but it was an outgrowth of this black metal movement in Norway and other parts of the world, which continues to exist today, in which bands adopted a magnificent, frenetic, hard-driving style of playing and very deeply and directly embraced satanic aesthetic and philosophy in ways that Ozzy Osbourne and others only pretended to. And I wanted to play a song from one of my favorite bands, Darkthrone, one of the great bands of the black metal movement. They continue to record today, and their musicianship is just extraordinary. It's not music that is for everybody, but the completeness and the individuality and the quality of their playing demonstrates why the black metal scene was and remains to such a potent force in the world today. Something I have to say in tribute to Darkthrone and other bands that are part of the black metal world is that it's extremely, extremely important to them to demonstrate aesthetic integrity. They do very, very little licensing. If you were to go online and look for a Darkthrone t-shirt or look for a Darkthrone pin, you'd have a very hard time finding one. It's not because people don't want these things, and it's not because the aesthetic isn't popular. I mean, look at how many people wear Guns N' Roses t-shirts who have never listened to a bar of Guns N' Roses. You know, the aesthetic is very, very popular, but these bands, and Darkthrone in particular, engage in very, very little licensing. So they really, their words and their deeds square. Another artist who has been influenced by Satanic philosophy and who I love is, of course, Glenn Danzig. And Glenn is very familiar with the thought of Anton LaVey and other outsider figures, and it's formed part of his outlook. Likewise, Marilyn Manson. And I wanted to play this brief clip of Marilyn talking about his philosophy.
Well, I'm very much into philosophy. A lot of different philosophers that I've read over the years, like Nietzsche, Darwin, Freud, Aleister Crowley, and finally Anton LaVey. And fortunately, he's still alive, so I got to meet with him and talk about his ideas and things like that. And in America, Satanism is sensationalized and kind of misunderstood, and people associate it with worshiping the devil and things like that. But it's really a philosophy about individuality and self-preservation. It's about being your own God. And that's a lot of the things that I've agreed with, so that's why I became friends with him. But by no means is that the only idea that I associate myself with, because I incorporate a lot of different philosophies into what I'm about, including Christianity. There's a lot of valuable lessons to be learned from the Bible. I just feel that the way a lot of people interpret it, particularly in the USA, is very hypocritical, and that's what I try and open people's mind to, that there is different ways of looking at things rather than what we've been told over the past several hundred years.
Now, I identify with everything that Marilyn said in that interview, and I celebrate his point of view, but I do want to note one thing, and this is probably one area where where my search personally takes a different path from what he was observing. The reference to Satanism as being a establishment of oneself as one's own God, or the idea of extolling the personal will as that which you can venerate, is something that certainly figures into the outlook of the Church of Satan today. For example, Peter Gilmore, the current head of the Church of Satan, is ardently atheistic, and his position, somewhat as Marilyn was enunciating here, is one that there is no figure called Satan. Satan is just a metaphor for the highest in human will. That's not necessarily a point of view that's universally shared among intelligent people who search within Satanism. My search is a metaphysical search, which is to say a search for that which goes beyond the physical, which goes beyond the conception of the individual as being nothing other than a collection of blood and cellular matter, and the extolling of one's own will. I believe, personally speaking, that our primeval ancestors were very correct in personifying certain energies, whether you use the term Set or Satan or Lucifer, or for that matter Minerva or Apollo or Diana or Zeus. I believe that our ancient ancestors were profoundly insightful in bringing these personified deific qualities to eternal energies. So, although I dig and I venerate what Marilyn was about, that particular view is not necessarily my point of view, nor is it a point of view that one finds generally. Some people certainly do have that point of view. I would say probably Peter Gilmore would agree with that, and I respect and honor Peter, but that point of view is not, personally speaking, my own. This is an image of the great Genesis Peorage, who I mentioned earlier, who just spoke in town via Skype connection the other night. She, too, has created this magnificent outsider aesthetic that busts up and destroys boundaries. She had some contact and collaboration with Anton LaVey, and Jen and her collaborators have created just a wonderful, unclassifiable system of search that I think, again, has sort of overturned the chessboard of the expected. Anton has reemerged in our culture, this time in the previous season of American Horror Story, where a character portrays the figure of Anton LaVey in a season that's dedicated to a kind of antichrist figure ushering in an apocalypse. And so let's take a little look at the dramatized Anton.
And then they came.
sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the whole moon became as blood. And the stars fell from the heaven to the earth, for the great day of wrath is come. I am in the presence of my Lord.
Where are you?
I am Anton LaVey, Black Pope of the Church of Satan, and these are my cardinals. I fake my death to prepare for this day.
I have no idea what you're talking about. What's going on here?
We followed a dark star from the west. The signs are impossible to miss. The temperature in this house, a home built over the portal to hell. The crows worshipping from above.
The omens are complete. You're the chosen one.
The time has come to remove the scales from your eyes, to show you your true power.
Something changed in Michael. It was like they opened a door and they showed him his true path.
Now, my friends in the Church of Satan, shall we say, were not amused with this depiction of Anton, but I take a more convivial view of it, I suppose. I think that it's inevitable that everybody's going to pass into some kind of pop culture characterization, and I think it probably represents one of the many ways in which ideas, in ways that we may like or dislike, come to sort of permeate the groundwater of culture. I, for one, got sort of a great kick out of it. Another movie that I've greatly enjoyed that has a very interesting and I think wonderful view of satanic philosophy is The Devil's Advocate from 1997. And there are a couple of monologues that Al Pacino delivers in this movie that I think, ironically enough, even though it's not some work of canonical literature, probably summarize satanic philosophy in a way that is artful, compelling, and that I find very personally and deeply affecting.
Well, what do you think he's paying us in goat's blood? Hey, Tarzan, we're billing you out at $400 an hour, my friend. I don't see a whole lot of pro bono work in your immediate future.
I figured you came down here to make sure I didn't fuck this up.
Oh, maybe I did. Don't get too cocky, my boy, no matter how good you are. Don't ever let him see you coming. That's the gaff, my friend. You gotta keep yourself small, innocuous. Maybe the little guy. You know, the nerd, the leper, shit-kicking surfer. Look at me. Underestimated from day one. You'd never think I was a master of the universe now, would you?
Who are you carrying all those bricks for, anyway? God? Is that it? God? Well, I tell you, let me give you a little inside information about God. God likes to watch. He's a prankster. Think about it. He gives man instincts. He gives you this extraordinary gift, and then what does he do? I swear, for his own amusement, his own private cosmic gag reel, he sets the rules in opposition. It's the goof of all time. Look, but don't touch. Touch, but don't taste. Taste, don't swallow. And while you're jumping from one foot to the next, what is he doing? He's laughing his sick fucking ass off. He's a tight ass. He's a sadist. He's an absentee landlord. Worship that? Never.
Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, is that it?
Why not? I'm here on the ground with my nose in it since the whole thing began. I've nurtured every sensation man has been inspired to have. I cared about what he wanted, and I never judged him. Why? Because I never rejected him. In spite of all his imperfections, I'm a fan of man. I'm a humanist.
Now, how's that for a piece of theology? That's right. Let's hear it. My friend Michael Muhammad Knight converted to Islam around the age of 15 when he saw Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X. And he asked the question, can a movie be sacred scripture? And my response to that is, yes, yes. Here's a piece of prime evidence. Now, I challenge those of you here in the audience, I challenge those of you who are interested in satanic philosophy to write on that scale, to write on that scale. There's not a good literature being produced today from the satanic point of view. Nothing that touches the quality esoterically, psychologically, theologically of what was expressed there. Be healthfully challenged by that. Aspire in that direction. That's my challenge to you. Polanski directed another wonderful movie with a satanic theme, The Ninth Gate, in 1999. Yes. All right. I like it here. Those guys in New York just don't understand. This is one of his most underappreciated movies and quite a wonderful movie. And I wanted to play this scene in which the character of Johnny Depp not only shows you why it is so difficult to quit smoking, but he encounters this young woman who's an emissary of Satan, who's reading a particular book that does not appear in the great novel, The Dumas Club, on which this movie is based, but which Polanski interjected as kind of a cosmic joke. Watch carefully the cover of her book.
Hello again. You didn't say you were bound for Central.
Neither did you.
What are you doing here?
Reading
I can see that.
and bumping into people unexpectedly.
Yes. Unexpectedly right.
Are you on a business trip? Is that why you always carry that thing around?
Is this part of your course?
My course?
Winning friends and influencing people. You said you were a student.
Did I? So I am, in a way. I like books.
Now, Polanski has this bizarre, wonderful precognitive sense of everything that's going on in our culture. It was years after this film was made, maybe about 6 years after, that a new biography of Charles Manson was published. And it was revealed in this book that when Manson was a kid in reformatory school or boys' prison, one of his favorite books was How to Win Friends and Influence People, so he could become a good leader. That's actually always been one of my favorite books, quite frankly, because it's filled with shrewd insights about human nature. Don't be put off by the familiar, domesticated, or slightly hokey nature of the book. It is a book that is just filled with superb insights into human nature, and I think Polanski is winking at us there. Don't ignore his wink. Recent movies, of course, have popularized the image of Loki in this way that is not exactly familiar from the illuminated manuscript that we looked at earlier, but Loki, as directed by the great Kenneth Branagh, is this wonderful, alluring, attractive anti-hero, as is Maleficent, the mistress of evil. I haven't seen this new release. When we first put this presentation together in New York just a few weeks ago, it hadn't come out yet, but just take a look at the horns and the cape and the color and everything. We are absolutely, as a culture, incapable of getting away from the satanic, even though we can't utter the name. My friend Tim Boda, a wonderful artist, did this illustration for me of the mystic Neville Goddard as Prometheus, Neville as a kind of light bringer, which is an illustration that I really love and that I think captures something that we're burning to express, wishing to express in our culture. And of course, what about the question of ethics in all of this? You know, people continue to associate the satanic with the evil, the maleficent, the violent, or the hedonistic. I wrote this article at Medium, which I encourage you to take a look at, not right now, but after you go home tonight or tomorrow, in which I distill a set of ethics that I think can be derived from the tradition of the heroic Satan, the romantic Satan, the primeval Satan, the Promethean Satan, the serpent of wisdom. This is not a path that's bereft of ethics, that's bereft of a code of honor. It's a tougher path because instead of attaching yourself to a tradition and mouthing things that you heard somewhere about thy will be done and blessed are the poor in spirit and non-attachment, things that are just kind of received bits of wisdom that we often repeat like pieces of catechism, it pushes you to devise your own path, your own code, your own sense of honor, your own sense of what, if anything, you owe to other people. And what people? This is not a path bereft of ethics, but it's a harder path. So finally, in the end, those of you who follow me on social media know that I promised that there would be a little surprise in store for you. So I would never break my word and not deliver a surprise to you. So I want to send you home tonight with a little gift, or you can refuse this gift. You don't have to use it. This is, of course, a cultural and literary lecture. I'm not propagating or proselytizing. I would never cheapen this podium by trying to promulgate some spiritual point of view. The choice is entirely your own. But I made reference earlier to the fact that we make these points about things. We have entire discussions about things, not knowing from whence an idea comes. We talk about possession, and we're drawing upon The Exorcist without even knowing it. We talk about pacts with the devil, and not even knowing where does that come from? What is that notion? Well, I wanted to share one such notion with you that really existed in our primeval history. You can use it if you feel like it. This is a translation from Isaiah 28:15 that probably formed the earliest basis for the idea of making a pact with the forces of outsiderdom, a pact with what later came to be called the Satanic. It's a passage from Isaiah 28:15 in which some are said to have protected themselves from plague and bad tidings by making a covenant with Sheol, the Jewish underworld, the Jewish afterlife, a concept that later came to be falsely conflated and improperly understood as being synonymous with something called hell. But this is some of the earliest utterances translated by the Jewish Publication Society in 1985 of the idea of making a pact with the Satanic. You recall I said earlier that the tradition goes that if you pray to Kali, you'll get exactly what you want, but you will also unleash chaos. If you eat from the tree of life, you will gain illumination, but you will also unleash friction. If you steal fire from the gods to illuminate yourself and others, you will accomplish great things. You may also encourage wrath. This wrath may also be alleviated. Maybe this wrath is worth it. I don't know. Only you can find out for yourself. I believe in experiential philosophy. I classify myself, always have, as a believing historian, and I believe that spiritual, ethical, transcendental ideas are there to be experienced. If you wish to experience this, I'm giving you a tool that you could use or not use. The choice is entirely your own. I can think of nothing more satanic. And thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you.